A widow stood alone in the freezing dark, and the only living thing that had not turned away from her was a dog nobody had wanted. That is where this story begins. But before the beginning, there is a moment you need to see. Picture a night so cold that the air itself seems to have stopped breathing. Snow falling without wind, straight down, thick and silent, like the world is being slowly buried under something it cannot name. A stone bluff rises from the frozen earth at the edge of a narrow valley, gray and ancient, older than anything standing in the small town below. And in that rock face, a crack of warm amber light, faint, steady, alive. A man is kneeling in the snow in front of that crack. His hands are wrapped in cloth gone dark with blood. He is shaking, not from cold alone. He is the kind of man who has never knelt before anything in his life, not in church, not before his elders, not before any person he considered beneath him. And yet, here he is, on both knees, pressing his fist against solid stone. Because inside that stone, people are breathing. They are warm. They are alive. And the woman who made it that way, the same woman this man had called an animal in front of the whole valley, the same woman he had tried to destroy with paperwork and whispers and the slow, grinding machinery of small-town judgment, that woman is the one he is begging to let him in. Remember that image. Hold it. Because now we go back, weeks earlier, to where it all began. The trunk hit the frozen ground with a sound like a door slamming shut on everything that had come before. Clara May Sutton stood on the narrow porch of a house that had never truly felt like hers and watched the door close behind her husband. No argument, no raised voice. Thomas Sutton had simply carried her belongings outside while she stood in the kitchen, and then he had locked the door and gone back to his supper. She could see the lamplight through the window, warm and yellow, as though nothing had happened. She was 32 years old. She had $23 in the pocket of her coat. She had a cast iron pot, 2 quilts worn thin at the edges, and a hand axe with a loose eye that rattled when she lifted it. The ground beneath her feet was already freezing into ruts from the wagon wheels, and the sky to the north had the low gray look that meant serious weather was building somewhere beyond the ridgeline. Her daughter Nora, 8 years old, was at her grandmother's house 9 miles away through timber she could not cross in the dark. The road between here and there would be impassable in a matter of days once the deep cold settled in. She had no shelter. She had no plan. She had nothing but a piece of land. 20 acres her father had registered in her name before the laws changed. A steep hollow with broken limestone and a creek that disappeared underground somewhere in the rocks. Land nobody had wanted. Land that had her name on it and nobody else's. And then something moved beneath the wagon tongue. The dog was not much to look at. Brindle-coated, one ear torn at the tip, ribs showing through his fur like the frame of something only partially built. He had been living behind the general store for as long as anyone could remember, surviving on scraps and goodwill that had mostly run out. Nobody had claimed him. Nobody had tried. He had simply existed at the edge of the town's attention, unwanted in the particular way that becomes invisible over time. He looked up at Clara with eyes that held no accusation and no pity. She did not invite him. She did not call to him. She simply turned and began walking toward the hollow, and he fell into step beside her as though this had always been the arrangement. She named him Dust before they reached the tree line, It seemed to fit. The hollow was everything she remembered and nothing she had hoped for. Broken limestone shelves jutted from the hillside at odd angles, too fractured for building, too unpredictable for planting. The scrub cedar growing along the bluff was too twisted for timber. There was no flat ground worth the name, no stand of straight wood close enough to drag before the cold came down in earnest. The lean-to her father had built years ago had lost its roof to some forgotten storm, leaving only 3 rotting posts and a crossbeam that sagged in the middle like a man who had given up. Clara set the trunk down and looked at what she had. A broken axe, a cast-iron pot, 2 thin quilts, $23 that would not buy enough timber to build 4 walls before the freeze, even if she could haul it herself, and perhaps 6 weeks before the kind of cold settled in that killed what it caught outside. The arithmetic was not in her favor. She knew it. She did the numbers 3 times standing in the dark and got the same answer each time. Not enough. Not enough wood. Not enough tools. Not enough time. Not enough of anything a person needed to build something real before winter arrived in full. She thought about Nora, 8 years old, small for her age, with her father's dark eyes and her grandfather's habit of going very quiet when she was thinking hard. Nora, who had never spent a night wondering if she would be warm by morning. Nora, who trusted her mother in the particular uncomplicated way that children trust before the world has given them reason not to. Clara could not afford to fail her. She was still standing there, running the numbers for the 4th time and finding the same impossible answer when dust began to bark. Not his uncertain bark, the one he used for squirrels and shadows. This was urgent and precise, aimed at a single point on the limestone bluff above the hollow. He ran to the rock face, and back to Clara, and back to the rock, his whole body insisting on something she had not yet seen. She followed him. The crack in the limestone was narrow, barely the width of her hand at first glance, a seam where the rock face had shifted at some point long before anyone now living had been born. What caught her attention was not the crack itself, but the dead grass at its base. In the cold wind pouring down the hollow, every blade of grass was bending away from the bluff, except here. Here the grass trembled toward the rock. Air was moving, not outward, inward, being pulled gently and steadily through the crack and into whatever lay beyond it. Clara pressed her bare hand to the opening. The air that moved against her palm was cool. But it was not the sharp, killing cold of the wind that had been cutting through her coat all evening. It was still air, old air, the kind of cool that lives deep underground where the seasons do not reach, where temperature stays the same through summer and winter alike, because the stone itself holds the memory of something steady. Her father's voice came back to her as clearly as if he were standing beside her in the dark. He had said it once when she was small, walking with him along the old mining cuts behind his property, pointing at the places where the earth exhaled. Find where the rock breathes slow, Clara. The cold cannot follow you there. She had been 7 years old. She had not understood what he meant. She understood now. Clara pressed her shoulder to the crack and pushed. Then she picked up the hand axe with the loose eye and she began to work. It took nearly an hour to widen the opening enough to push through. Her palms split before she was halfway done. She did not stop. When she finally squeezed through into the chamber beyond, she stood very still and let her eyes adjust to the darkness. The ceiling was high enough to stand beneath. The floor was packed earth, dry and firm. The walls were raw limestone, cold to the touch but solid. No seams for wind to knife through, no gaps for weather to find. And at the far edge of the ceiling, barely visible in the darkness, a narrow fissure where the air moved in its slow and steady pull upward and out. Clara stood in the center of the chamber and did the arithmetic again. A cabin needed walls she could not build in time. This place had walls already standing. Stone walls, 4 feet thick, that no wind could penetrate. A cabin needed a roof she could not raise alone. This place had a ceiling of solid rock. A cabin needed fuel to fight the cold bleeding through every seam. This place had no seams. The risk was real. Fire in an enclosed space could fill it with smoke. The fissure might not draw reliably. Water could come through in a hard rain. She cataloged the dangers carefully, the way her father had taught her to catalog the dangers of the old mine shafts. Not to frighten herself out of going forward, but to know exactly what she was walking into. Certain failure outside, possible success inside. She had never been afraid of possible. Clara turned to the entrance. In the crack of opening behind her, she could see Dust sitting in the snow, watching her with calm attention, waiting to see what came next. She reached out and ran her fingers along the limestone wall. Cold, solid, patient in the way that only very old things are patient. Then she noticed it, carved into the stone near the entrance at about shoulder height. Letters cut deep by someone who had wanted them to last. J.M. One hard winter. She touched the letters, felt the depth of them. Whoever had made these marks had pressed hard, had taken time, had wanted something of themselves left behind in this place. She did not know yet what those initials meant. She did not know yet what story lived inside them. But something in the weight of those letters made her reach into her pocket for the small carpenter's nail she always carried, and press the tip of it against the stone just below. CS, she scratched, arriving. She stepped back, looked at what she had written beside what someone else had written, in the same stone, in the same cold, in the same hollow, at the edge of the known world. Then she turned to Dust. "This is our home," she said. The dog walked in past her and lay down in the center of the chamber floor, circled once, and settled with a long exhale that fogged in the cold air and dissolved. Clara picked up the hand axe and got to work. Ezra Marsh came up the hollow on the 3rd morning. He was not a man who wasted movement. Every step he took had a purpose, and the purpose that morning was to look at what the widow was doing and tell her, with the authority of someone who had survived more winters than she had years, exactly why it would not work. He was 58 years old. His face had the weathered, settled look of a man who had long ago made peace with hard things, or had simply stopped expecting anything different. He walked the perimeter of the hollow the way a doctor walks a sickbed, touching nothing, missing nothing, his eyes moving from the broken limestone shelves to the scrub cedar too twisted for timber to the lean-to that had already begun to sag further in the cold. He stopped at the entrance to the chamber. He looked at the crack Clara had widened. He looked at the flat stones she had begun stacking to either side of the opening. He looked at the drag marks in the frost where she had been hauling material, and the pile of split wood she had managed to gather, and the thread she had tied near the entrance to read the movement of the air. Then he looked at her. "Spend one night in rock instead of timber," he said, "and they carry you out stiff by dawn." He said it the way a man states an unpleasant fact, without cruelty, without pleasure. Simply a thing that was true, delivered to someone who needed to hear it before she made a mistake she could not come back from. Clara looked at him. She did not argue. She did not explain. She had learned early that explaining yourself to a man who has already decided costs more than it returns. "Thank you for coming," she said. Ezra Marsh looked at her a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back down the hollow the way he had come, his boots crunching on the frozen ground until the sound disappeared into the cedars. Clara watched him go. Then she picked up her axe and went back to work. She had learned something from his visit, though not what he had intended to teach. She had learned that the clock was running, that people were watching, and that the only argument worth making was the one she built with her own hands. The first crisis came without warning, as the real ones always do. She had been working on the fire problem for 2 days. The theory was sound. She understood it in the way she understood things her father had taught her, not as memorized instruction but as felt knowledge, the kind that lives in the hands and not the head. The fissure at the top of the chamber drew air upward and out. If the fire was positioned correctly near the entrance, the heat would rise, catch that draw, and pull the smoke up and through rather than letting it spread across the chamber floor. She had tested it 3 times with small fires and a rag soaked in ash. The smoke had lifted cleanly each time, threading up toward the ceiling and disappearing through the fissure with a steadiness that felt almost like a promise. On the 4th test, something changed. She had built the fire slightly larger this time. She needed to know if the draw could handle real heat before she trusted it with her life and Nora's. The flames caught well. The smoke began to rise. And then, without any warning she could identify, the draw shifted. The smoke that had been climbing steadily toward the ceiling bent backward, rolled low, and began to spread across the floor of the chamber in a slow, dark tide. Clara moved fast. She grabbed the quilts from the sleeping shelf and used them to beat the fire down, coughing hard, eyes streaming, backing toward the entrance on her hands and knees until she was out in the snow, gasping cold air that felt like swallowing glass. She sat in the snow for a long time. The cold pressed in from every direction, deliberate and patient. Her hands had stopped feeling like hands somewhere around the 2nd day, becoming instead a pair of instruments she operated from a distance. Her lips were cracked at both corners. The bruise on her left shoulder from rolling a limestone slab had gone from purple to the dull green of something healing slowly and unhappily. She did the math she had been avoiding. The draft had failed. She did not know why. She did not know if it would fail again. She had 3 matches left. The wood stack was enough for perhaps a week of careful burning. The food she had carried in her trunk would last 2 people through the end of the month. She thought about going back. Not to Thomas. She had closed that door the moment she turned away from the lamplight in his kitchen window. But there were other options. She could find work as a housekeeper, a laundress, someone's hired girl. She could find a room somewhere warm and send for Nora and survive the winter in the ordinary way that women survived things. She could keep her daughter safe. Her hands tightened on the quilt she was still holding. And then she heard the boots. The old man was sitting on a limestone shelf above the hollow, as though he had been there for some time, watching with the particular patience of someone who had learned that most situations reveal themselves if you wait long enough to see what they actually are, He was 64 years old. His back carried the permanent curve of a man who had spent decades in spaces too low to stand in, hauling loads too heavy to put down. His hands were extraordinary, thick with calluses layered over calluses, the knuckles large and scarred, hands that had spent a lifetime learning the language of rock through the palms. He looked at the smoke still drifting out of the entrance. He looked at Clara sitting in the snow with her burned-down fire and her 3 remaining matches. He looked at Dust, who had stood and was watching him with calm professional attention. "You're reading the draft wrong," he said. "That's why the smoke came back at you." Clara looked up at him. "Who are you?" "Silas Holt." He climbed down from the shelf with the careful deliberateness of a man who has made peace with his joints. "I cut salt caves before the war, laid dry stone for 20 years after. I know what rock does when the pressure changes outside." He stopped at the entrance to the chamber and looked at her thread, still tied near the opening. "That tells you the air is moving. It doesn't tell you why it stops." "And you're going to tell me." "I'm going to show you." He looked at her steadily. "Unless you'd rather sit in the snow." Clara stood up. She did not thank him. She picked up the axe and walked back to the entrance. That was enough. Silas did not teach through explanation. He taught through hands and attention. The first lesson was about pressure. When the temperature outside dropped sharply, sharper than the temperature inside the rock, the draft pulled reliably because warm air inside sought the cold above. But in the afternoon, when the weak winter sun warmed the air outside slightly, the pressure equalized and the draft weakened or failed entirely. A fire built during a good draw could suffocate a chamber by afternoon. He made Clara hang a second thread near the fissure at the ceiling, not just at the entrance. 2 reading points. The entrance thread told her if air was moving. The ceiling thread told her where it was going. "If the ceiling thread goes still," he said, "the fire comes out. No argument, no waiting, no hoping it corrects itself. Out. And if I need the heat, then you learn when the draw runs and build your schedule around it. Rock doesn't bend to your schedule. You bend to rocks." While he spoke, Wade Corbin appeared at the entrance, 39 years old, Thomas Sutton's cousin, with the kind of surface pleasantness that careful people learn to read as warning. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at what Clara was building with an expression that managed to be both pleasant and dismissive at once. He said nothing this visit, simply looked, then rode back down the hollow. He always left before she could answer him. She had noticed that about men who needed the last word. They arranged things so they left before anyone else could speak. The second lesson was about the hearth. Silas had her move the fire position entirely, not at the back of the chamber, but near the entrance, angled so the heat rose directly toward the ceiling draw. Clear margins on all sides, so sparks had nowhere to travel. He showed her how to build the hearth base from flat limestone, slabs chosen for density because dense stone held heat longer and released it slowly through the night after the fire burned down. "You're not fighting the cold," he said. "You're asking the rock to carry it for you. The rock will, if you set it up right." Della Vane came up the hollow that afternoon with a cloth-wrapped bundle she set just inside the entrance without comment, cornbread and a jar of preserved beans. She looked at the hearth. She looked at the ceiling thread. She looked at the sorted wood stacks. She did not say she believed it would work. She did not say she didn't. She picked up the empty cloth and walked back down the hollow, and Clara ate the cornbread that evening and felt, for the first time since the trunk had hit the frozen ground, that she was not entirely alone. The third lesson was about fuel. Cedar, for starting. It caught fast and burned hot. Oak and hickory for the long burn, the overnight coals that kept the stone warm through the deepest hours. Every piece of wood was to be sorted before it came inside and stacked by purpose, not by size. "Don't burn good oak to light a fire," Silas said. "Don't burn cedar to hold one through the night. Every piece of wood has one job. Learn the jobs." Clara listened. She watched. She worked. And somewhere in those first days with Silas in the chamber, something shifted in the way she understood the space around her. Not as a shelter she was hiding in, but as a system she was learning to read, with its own logic and its own rules that rewarded attention and punished assumption. On the day Clara went to get Nora, she made the 9 miles through timber she knew in just over 3 hours, moving fast enough to stay warm. Nora was sitting at the kitchen table at her grandmother's house with a book open in front of her. 8 years old, small for her age, with the particular stillness of a child who had learned to wait and watch before reacting. She looked up when Clara came through the door, and her face did the thing it did. That quiet, certain thing, relief without drama. The look of someone whose inner compass had just found its bearing again. She did not ask where they were going. She simply closed the book, put it in her bag, and reached for her coat. That was Nora. She trusted her mother with the particular uncomplicated faith of a child who had never been given a reason not to. And Clara felt the weight of that trust settle on her shoulders like something physical. Not a burden, but a ballast. The thing that kept her from drifting. The road back was harder. Nora's legs were shorter, and the wind had picked up from the north. They stopped twice to rest. Clara gave Nora her extra pair of wool socks to pull over her mittens. They talked about ordinary things, what Nora had been reading, whether Dust had a favorite place to sleep, what the hollow looked like when the frost was on the limestone in the early morning. Nora walked into the chamber and stood very still. The fire was going. The draft was pulling clean. The sleeping shelf was covered with both quilts, folded. The wood was sorted and stacked in 2 rows along the left wall. The food pit Silas had helped her dig was covered with a flat stone. A tin cup hung on a peg near the entrance. Dust walked in past both of them and lay down in the center of the floor, circled once, and settled. Nora looked at the walls. She reached out and touched the limestone. The curve of it, the texture, the way it held the warmth the fire had been building for days in its slow stone way. Then she saw the letters carved near the entrance. "Mama," she said, "who is J.M.?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Someone who was here before us." Nora looked at the name a little longer. Then she looked at what was written below it. C.S. Arriving. And something moved across her face that was too complicated for Clara to name exactly. Not fear, not quite wonder. Something in between. The feeling of a place that has history and has decided to share it with you. "It smells like Grandpa's workshop," Nora said finally. "Stone and wood smoke." Clara had to look away for a moment. Her father had worked stone most of his life. He had talked to it the way other people talk to their horses, conversationally, with the assumption that it was listening. She had thought, for years, that it was an odd habit. She no longer thought so. "Come look at the sleeping shelf," she said. "The curved wall holds the heat through the night. You'll be warm." Nora came and looked. She ran her hand along the curved limestone the way her grandfather would have done. Then she opened her bag and took out the book she had been reading and set it on the corner of the shelf, carefully, the way you set something down in a place you intend to return to. "For bedtime," she said. Clara nodded. Her throat was doing something she did not want it to do in front of her daughter. "For bedtime," she agreed. The filing came on a gray afternoon, delivered by a man who seemed embarrassed to be there, and got back on his horse as quickly as professional dignity allowed. Clara read the document twice. The language was formal and circular, but the meaning was plain. An official review of living conditions. Wade Corbin had filed a complaint with the county. A determination would be made as to whether the current circumstances were appropriate for the raising of a minor child. If found inadequate, temporary custody arrangements would be considered. Temporary. That word. She knew what temporary meant when one party had money and connections and the other had a limestone chamber and a $3 axe with a loose eye. She set the document down on the flat stone that served as their table. She looked at the chamber, at what she had built, at what she was still building, at the sorted wood and the hung thread and the food pit, and the sleeping shelf where Nora's book sat on the corner waiting for nighttime. She looked at the fissure in the ceiling where the smoke rose cleanly. And then Nora came in from outside, where she had been collecting flat stones for what she had decided was going to be a proper doorstep. And she set her collection down in a careful row and looked up at her mother with those dark eyes that saw more than she was supposed to, and said, "There's a man watching from the ridge. He's been there a while." Clara looked out. She could see the ridge. She could see the shape of a man on horseback against the gray sky, not hiding, not approaching, just watching. Wade Corbin, waiting to see when she would break. She felt something settle in her then, not anger, which burns fast and wastes itself, but something slower and more durable. The kind of resolution that does not need to announce itself. She turned back to Nora. "Those are good stones," she said. "The flat ones work best for a step. Lay them close so the gaps don't catch a foot in the dark." Nora looked at the stones. Then she looked at her mother's face, reading it the way she read everything, carefully, thoroughly, without rushing to a conclusion. "Okay, Mama," she said, and she went back to laying the stones. That night, after Nora was asleep on the shelf with the quilt tucked around her and dust pressed warm against her back, Silas came to sit by the fire. He did not ask about the document. He knew. The hollow carried sound, and a man who had spent his life underground had learned to read what the air brought him. He sat with a piece of cedar he was shaping into something, his knife moving slowly, shavings curling onto the chamber floor. The thread near the ceiling hung still. The fire was low and even, the oak coals breathing their heat into the stone. "Your father," Silas said after a long time. "Did he teach you about the old way of reading rock for water?" "Some of it." "Then you know that the rock remembers everything that's passed through it. Every season, every drought, every flood." He turned the cedar piece over in his hands. "A man who reads rock right can tell you what happened in a hollow 50 years ago, just from the marks the water left." "What are you saying, Silas?" "I'm saying that this rock remembers you're here. And it will remember you were here long after the paper that man filed turns to dust." He set down the cedar and looked at her directly. Build it right. Let them come and look. If you've built it right, there's nothing for their paper to catch. And if they decide the paper matters more than what I've built? Silas was quiet for a moment. Then we build something they can't argue with. Something so solid and so warm and so right that the only way to say it's wrong is to stand inside it in the cold and lie. The fire shifted. A coal broke apart in a small shower of light and settled. Clara looked at the letters carved into the wall. J.M. One hard winter. C.S. Arriving. She reached over and added 2 small words below what she had written before. Still here. She put the nail back in her pocket. Tell me, she said to Silas, about the fissure, about why it runs stronger in the morning than the afternoon. I want to understand the whole of it. Silas picked up his cedar piece again. Then get comfortable, he said, because the rock's been learning that schedule for about 10,000 years, and it'll take me a while to catch you up. Outside, the cold deepened. The ridge was empty. The man who had been watching was gone. Inside the chamber, the stone held its warmth, and a woman and an old man sat by a low fire and talked about what the earth knows that people have forgotten, while a child slept safely against a curved stone wall, and a dog kept watch at the door, and the thread near the ceiling hung perfectly, beautifully still. The chamber became home in the way that places become home, not in a single moment, but through the accumulation of small ones. The tin cup moved from its peg to the flat stone that served as their table because Nora preferred it there. Dust developed the habit of circling twice before settling, always ending up facing the entrance. Nora found a shell-shaped fossil in the wall near the sleeping shelf and declared it hers. The county man came to inspect on a gray morning, practical and unhurried. He walked the chamber, examined the food stores, asked Nora a question Clara could not hear, and received a thorough answer. He wrote in his ledger, closed it, and looked at Clara. The conditions appear adequate, he said. The complaint appears to have been filed without the substantiation required to sustain it. He tipped his hat. He walked back down the hollow. Clara sat down on the stone bench and did not move for a long time. Outside, dust settled across the entrance in his customary position, and the hollow was quiet, and the thread above the fissure pulled its slow and steady pull, and that was enough. Nora appeared at her elbow. He said I was well-spoken, she said, with the satisfaction of a child who has been told something true that she is also pleased to have confirmed. I told him about thermal mass. Did you? He didn't know what it was. I explained it. She paused. I think he understood most of it. Clara put her arm around Nora's shoulders and held her for a moment. We're all right, Clara said, not to Nora exactly, to the room, to the stone. The stone said nothing. It had been saying nothing for 10,000 years, which was its way of saying everything. Callum Hayes had been coming to the hollow for several weeks by this point. A widower of 43, a blacksmith whose wife had died 3 years prior, who had first appeared saying he needed stone for a forge repair. He stayed longer than the stone required. He built a proper step at the entrance from flat limestone fitted without gaps. He helped extend the drainage channel. He asked before changing anything, every time, without exception. Nora noticed before Clara did. She had the gift of observation that children develop when adults are interesting, and Callum Hayes was interesting to her in a specific way she could not yet name, but was filing carefully for future reference. One evening, she looked up from her book and said, without looking at either adult, "Mama, Callum was here again today." "I know," Clara said. "He helped with the drainage trench." "Uh-huh," said Nora, in a tone that suggested the drainage trench was not what she had in mind, and went back to her book. What Nora had noticed, and what Clara was not yet ready to name, was that the hollow felt different when Callum was in it. Not warmer, exactly. The stone managed that on its own. But different in the way a room is different when it contains someone who is glad to be there. Nora grasped that distinction completely and filed it next to her other observations. Clara filed it under things to think about later, when there was time. The chamber had become, without anyone quite declaring it, a place where other people came to ask questions. A woman named Mirabelle, whose root cellar had flooded 3 winters running, came up the hollow on a clear afternoon and asked about the food pit, how deep, how lined, whether the temperature held through a late thaw. Clara showed her. She stayed 2 hours. She left with sketches she had drawn herself on a piece of paper she had brought for the purpose, which meant she had been thinking about coming for a while before she came. An old farmer named Cutter, who had a bluff on his property he had always thought of as a liability, came to ask whether every crack was the same. Clara told him what Silas had told her, that you had to read each one separately, that no 2 rock faces breathed the same way, that the thread and the smoke and the quality of the air on your palm were the only instruments that mattered. Cutter listened with the patience of a man who had learned late in life that the things he had dismissed deserved a second look. He came back the following week and asked if she would come look at his bluff. She went. She spent an afternoon with her hand against the rock and the thread on its stick and dust sitting on a flat stone nearby, watching with the composed attention of an old professional. The crack Cutter had found was a drainage vent. She could read the watermarks that Silas had taught her to read, the lines that told you where floods had reached in years before. Not this one. But there was another crack, further along the bluff, almost hidden behind a cedar that had grown up against the rock face over many years. This one breathed differently. This one was worth widening. She showed Cutter what she had found and explained what she had looked for and why. He stood with his hand against the rock for a long time after she had moved it away. "My father always said there was something useful about this bluff," he said finally. "I thought he meant the timber." "He may have meant this," Clara said. Cutter looked at her. Then he looked at the rock. Then he went and got his tools. That was how knowledge moved, Clara was learning. Not through announcement or argument or the approval of people who had decided not to believe. It moved through demonstration, through the patient showing of one person to another, through the accumulated weight of things that worked when they needed to. She had not set out to teach anyone anything. She had set out to keep herself and her daughter warm through a winter that had decided to be serious about it. The teaching had followed from that, the way heat follows from fire, not intentional, not planned, simply the natural movement of something warm toward something cold. The message came to Silas on a Tuesday, delivered not in writing, but in the way messages traveled in small valleys, mouth to ear, along a chain of people who each understood their role in the passing of it. Wade Corbin had grazing land to lease for the spring season, good land, well watered, with terms that suited an old man who needed income more than he needed pride. The lease was available to anyone who wanted it. Anyone, that is, who was not currently helping a woman build something in a limestone hollow that Wade Corbin needed to fail. Silas told Clara on a Wednesday morning, standing in the entrance to the chamber with his coat still on, not sitting down, which told her before he spoke a word that he was not staying. "I can't keep coming up here," he said. He looked at the hearth, the thread, the sorted wood stacks, everything they had built together over the past weeks. He did not look at her face. "I've got to think about what happens to me when the spring comes. I'm 64 years old. I don't have the luxury of enemies I can't afford." Clara stood very still. "I understand," she said. "I don't think you do. I think you're being gracious, and that underneath that, you're furious and frightened. Both things can be true." He looked at her then. His face had the expression of a man setting down something heavy that he did not feel good about setting down. "What you've built here is right. It's solid. The draft runs clean. The stone is holding heat. The food pit will see you through. You know what you're doing. I know what you've taught me. You knew most of it before I got here. I just gave it language." He picked up his tools, always organized, always within reach. The fastidiousness of a man who had learned that a mislaid tool underground could mean not coming back up. If the weather breaks before spring, and it might not, you'll be all right. He walked to the entrance. He stopped there for a moment without turning around. "I'm sorry," he said. It was not the kind of apology that asks for absolution. It was the kind that simply states a truth too late to change. Then he walked down the hollow, and the sound of his boots faded, and Clara stood alone in the chamber with the thread pulling gently toward the fissure, and the fire burning low and even, and she listened to the silence he had left behind. That night, she held Nora while the child slept and did not sleep herself. The chamber was warm. The thread was steady. Everything Silas had taught her was working. Everything she had built was standing, and she was more frightened than she had been on the night she stood outside Thomas Sutton's locked door with $23 and a tin pot, because now there was more to lose. Nora shifted in her sleep, murmured something that did not resolve into words, and was still again. Dust lay across the entrance, head on his paws, one ear tracking the sounds of the hollow below. The wind had changed direction sometime in the past hour. Clara had felt it in the draw, a slight stuttering, the thread swinging and resettling. Nora stirred again, and this time surfaced partway into waking. "Mama," she said, her voice blurred with sleep. "Right here." A pause. The particular pause of a child assembling the world after dreams. "Will they take me away?" Clara looked at the fire, at the coals breathing their slow orange light against the hearthstones, at the thread above the entrance, motionless now, the air in perfect equilibrium. She kissed the top of Nora's head. "Go back to sleep. We'll talk in the morning." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then, "Dust is still watching." "Dust is always watching." "Okay." And she was asleep again, as children are, quickly and completely, with the enviable efficiency of someone who has decided that if the person they trust most says things are all right, things are all right. Clara lay awake for a long time, watching the fire, watching the thread, listening to the hollow breathe. Silas came back on a Thursday. He walked through the entrance, set his tools in their usual place near the left wall, picked up the piece of cedar he had been shaping, and sat down by the hearth as though he had never left. Clara handed him a cup of water. "Silas," she said. "The lease wasn't worth the terms," he said. He took the cup. Wade Corbin has never offered a fair arrangement in his life, and he wasn't about to start. I'd have been obligated through spring and into summer, and he'd have found a reason to reduce the payment by March. I've dealt with men like that before. He looked at the cedar piece, turning it in his hands. "Besides, I told you I'd show you how to widen the fissure if the draw ever needed help. I haven't done that yet." Clara sat down across the fire from him. They did not speak for a while. The fire crackled. The thread moved in its slow, steady pull. Outside, the hollow carried the quiet that had been building for 2 days now. The quiet that was not peace, but anticipation. "The air feels different," Clara said. Silas looked at the entrance hide. It hung without moving. Not the lively flutter of good cold wind, but a strange stillness, as though the weather had paused to gather itself. "Yes," he said. "Dust hasn't eaten since yesterday morning." Silas looked at the dog, who was sitting upright near the entrance instead of lying in his usual sprawl. He did not dismiss the dog's posture. "How's the wood stack?" 3 weeks of careful burning, maybe 4. Add to it today, whatever you can drag before dark." He looked at the ceiling. "And check the fissure. Make sure nothing's settled into it overnight." It was then that the revelation came, not in a moment of high drama, but quietly, sideways, through the hands of a child. Nora had been running her fingers along the walls in idle moments, the way children do with surfaces that interest them. She had found a shell-shaped fossil near the sleeping shelf. She had found a crack near the food pit that let in a thin line of light at a particular time of morning. And now she stood before the letters again, J.M., One Hard Winter, and below them, C.S., still here, tracing them with one finger, and she looked up at Silas. "Who is J.M.?" she asked. She had asked her mother once and received a careful non-answer. Silas went very still. He looked at the carved initials for long enough that Nora dropped her hand and simply waited, which was something she was unusually good at. "Those are old letters," he said finally. "I know they're old. I want to know whose." Silas set down his cedar piece. He looked at Clara, a look that was both question and statement at once. She gave him a small nod. "His name was Josiah Marsh," Silas said. "He was the oldest son of Ezra Marsh, the man who came up the hollow in the first days and told your mother this rock would kill her." Clara sat very still. "Josiah was 20, 21. It was a hard winter, years ago. A storm came down fast, faster than anyone expected, and Josiah was out on the ridge when it hit." Silas turned the cedar piece in his hands, not looking at either of them. He was smart. He knew he couldn't make it back to the farm. He remembered this hollow, remembered the bluff, and he came here. He got inside. He built a fire. The chamber was absolutely quiet. "He didn't know about the draw," Silas said. Nobody had taught him. He built the fire at the back of the chamber, the way you'd build a fire in a cave if nobody had told you otherwise, and the smoke had to cross the whole space to find the fissure. By afternoon, the pressure outside had equalized and the draw had slowed, and the smoke didn't lift the way it had in the morning, and he stopped. "He didn't know to put the fire out," Clara said. "No, he didn't." The silence stretched. Clara looked at the letters carved into the stone. J.M., One Hard Winter. She thought about a young man carving his initials into a wall in the dark, in the smoke, wanting to leave something of himself behind in the rock that was supposed to save him. She thought about Ezra Marsh, who had come up the hollow and told her this rock would kill her, and who had never been wrong about the thing he was right about. He had simply misread its lesson. The rock had not killed his son. The ignorance of how to read it had. And Ezra Marsh had carried that weight for years and had translated it into the only warning he knew how to give, because a father who has lost a son to a hollow does not think, "My son needed better teaching." He thinks, "This hollow kills." Clara reached out and touched the letters. Then she took the carpenter's nail from her pocket and completed the line she had started weeks ago. "Below still here," she added, 2 more words, small and deliberate, pressed deep into the limestone. Not alone. She stepped back and looked at what the wall held now. JM, one hard winter. CS, still here, not alone. She put the nail away. "We should check the fissure," she said, "and add to the wood stack before dark." Silas picked up his tools. Nora looked at the wall one more time. Then she picked up her book and went to sit near the entrance where the light was better, and she did not ask any more questions. She had the gift of knowing when the adults around her had said everything they were going to say for a while, and of being content with what had been given. The signs began the next morning. Dust would not eat. He paced the length of the chamber in a slow, continuous circuit, stopping at the entrance each time to stand and test the air with his nose. His coat was raised along the spine. Not the sharp rays of alarm, but the steady rays of sustained vigilance, a body holding itself ready for something it could smell coming from far off. The birds had changed. There were always a handful of small winter birds moving through the cedars, the occasional crow calling from the ridge. That morning there was nothing. The cedars were empty. The ridge was silent. Even the 2 ravens that had been spending their mornings on the limestone shelf above the entrance were gone. The sky was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the boiling dark of a summer storm. It was a subtler wrongness, a yellowed quality to the light that made everything look slightly unreal, the way old photographs look when the color has shifted in the decades since they were taken. The clouds to the north were colorless, a flat gray-white that had no texture and no movement, sitting on the horizon with the patient immobility of something that has decided where it is going. Clara went to every house she knew. She went to Della Vane first, because Della was the most likely to listen without laughing. She explained what she had seen: the birds, the dog, the sky, the stillness. Della looked at her own 2 chickens, who were huddled in the corner of their pen with their heads tucked, which they did not ordinarily do until well after dark. "I'll lay in extra wood," Della said, "and I'll send Eli to you if it comes on fast." It was the most Della had ever directly offered, and Clara took it for what it was. She went to the general store. She went to the smithy. She stood at the edge of the small gathering that always formed on the church steps on weekday mornings and said what she had come to say. The response was varied and entirely predictable. The storekeeper said that his barometric instrument showed nothing unusual. The Reverend said that weather was in the hands of Providence, and that mortal prediction was, at best, presumption. One of the young men who had come up the hollow on a dare some weeks back called out as she was leaving, "The cave woman thinks she can read clouds now. What's next? Reading entrails?" His friends laughed. Clara did not respond. She had learned that the people who most needed to hear a warning were frequently the last people to accept one, and that spending energy forcing acceptance was energy she did not have to spare. but she looked back once at the group on the steps, and she felt something that was not quite fear and not quite grief, but was in the same family as both, a foreknowledge of cost, of what it would mean when the thing that was coming arrived, and the preparation that had been refused could not be undone. She went back to the hollow. She and Silas worked until dark, adding every piece of wood that could be dragged before the light failed. They brought the wood stacks up to shoulder height on both walls and started a third stack near the food pit. They tested the fissure with a slow-burning twig and watched the smoke rise clean and steady. They lowered the entrance hide so that only the gap at the top remained. Nora helped without being asked, carrying the smallest pieces, stacking them in neat rows, asking no questions about why tonight felt different. She had learned to read the temperature of a situation from the way the adults around her moved, and she moved accordingly, quietly, with the steady focus of a child who has discovered that being useful is the best available form of comfort. When the wood was stacked and the food pit sealed, and the chamber as prepared as preparation could make it, the three of them sat by the fire and ate from the pot and listened to the hollow outside. The stillness had deepened, not peace, anticipation. "How long?" Clara asked Silas. He was watching the entrance hide. It hung without moving, no flutter, no sway, just a flat piece of leather against the dark. "Before morning," he said. "I'd guess before midnight." Nora looked at Dust, who had finally stopped pacing and sat at the entrance with his spine straight and his gaze fixed on something none of the humans could see. "Dust knows," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "He does. He always knows things before we do." Nora considered this. Maybe we should ask him things more often. Despite everything, despite the weight of what she could feel building in the air outside, despite all the people on the church steps who had laughed and gone home to their ordinary cabins, Clara almost smiled. "Maybe we should," she said. The storm arrived not with drama, but with decision. One moment the hollow was still. The next, the entrance hide bucked inward with a crack like a door slamming, and a sound began that was not wind in the ordinary sense, not the familiar whistle and push of winter weather, but something larger and less reasonable, a sustained shrieking that rose and fell in pitches that did not sound like atmosphere, but like intention, like something that had decided to take the world apart and was working its way methodically through the task. Clara moved to the hearth. She added oak, 2 good pieces, dense and slow-burning, and built the fire up to the size that would drive maximum heat into the stone for the hours ahead. The thread above the entrance swung hard toward the fissure. The draw was running stronger than she had ever felt it, the cold outside so intense that it was pulling the warm air from the chamber with real urgency, and the smoke rose in a straight, clean column without a single curl or hesitation. The stone was working. She had asked it to carry her and Nora through this, and it was answering. The noise outside was immense. It had a physical quality, a pressure against the walls, against the entrance stones, as though the weather were trying various entry points to see which would yield. None of them yielded. The stone had been in place for longer than anyone living could measure, and it had no interest in yielding to a single night's argument. Then Dust barked, urgent and specific, aimed at the entrance, repeated twice, and then he was pressing himself against the hide and whining. Clara pulled back the hide. The boy was face down in the snow 2 feet from the entrance. No coat, bare hands, And the color that his face was not supposed to be was the color it was. He had made it this far, and then his legs had stopped working, and he had gone down. Clara grabbed his arm and dragged him inside. Eli Vane was Della's son, 12 years old and slight for his age, and when she got his boots off his feet, were white in the way that means the cold had gone past the surface into the tissue beneath, not blue, white, the stage before blue. She packed warmed stones wrapped in cloth against his sides and chest. She got water heating in the pot. Warm, not hot. She wrapped him in both quilts and positioned dust against his back, and the dog settled there without being asked, his warm, solid weight pressing in with the steadiness of something that understood its purpose. Nora came out from behind the blanket divider and stood watching. "His mama sent him," she said. "I think so." "Because she knew you'd be here." Clara looked at her daughter. "Yes." Nora came and knelt beside Eli. She looked at his face, which was slowly losing that terrible stillness and beginning to show the small movements of someone returning to themselves. She reached out and pulled the quilt more firmly around his shoulder where it had slipped. "He's going to be okay," she said. Not a question. "If we do this right," Clara said. "Yes." The storm screamed and pushed at the stone, and the stone held, and the fire burned, and dust breathed his steady warmth against the frozen boy, and Clara worked. The knocking started an hour later. Not loud. The storm swallowed most of the sound. But Dust lifted his head, turned toward the entrance, and made a sound deep in his chest that was not a growl, but an acknowledgement. Della Vane was standing in the snow. Her coat was soaked through on the left side, and her face had the stunned quality of a person who has just learned that the world is larger and less manageable than they had assumed. "He came to you," she said. "He's inside. He's warming up. Get in." They came one by one, and in pairs after that. A family whose chimney had cracked. 2 brothers who had burned through their wood. A woman with 2 small children whose walls had given up their warmth sometime after midnight. And then, sometime in the deepest part of the night, when the storm was at its absolute worst, and the visibility in the hollow was nothing. No distance, no direction, just white and wind and cold. A shape appeared at the entrance that walked differently from the others. Wade Corbin went to his knees in the snow. His hands were wrapped in cloth that had gone dark with what had leaked from the burns beneath. He was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with temperature alone. He was shaking the way a man shakes when the thing he was most certain of turns out not to have been true. He looked up at Clara standing in the entrance. He had called her an animal. He had filed papers designed to take her child. He had pressured the one person willing to help her, and waited on the ridge to watch her break, and arranged the entire weight of a small community's judgment against a woman with $23 and a loose-eyed axe. He looked up at her, and he could not speak. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his hands. She thought about Nora asleep behind the blanket divider. She thought about J.M. carved into the stone. A young man who had died because nobody had taught him what he needed to know. She thought about what it would mean to be the kind of person who left someone in the snow. "Get in," she said. "Get warm." She stepped back from the entrance. Wade Corbin crawled inside, and the stone closed around all of them. The widow and the child, the old miner and the skeptic, the neighbor's son and the enemy at the gate, and held them with the same impartial warmth It had been holding for longer than any of them had been alive. The thread above the entrance pulled steady toward the fissure. The smoke rose clean. The rock never lied. It simply waited for the people inside it to tell the truth. 17 people in a space built for 3. That was the arithmetic of that first night, and like most arithmetic, it told you the facts without telling you what the facts meant. What it meant was this: the chamber that had seemed adequate for a woman, a child, and a dog now held 17 human beings in various states of cold, fear, shock, and physical damage, plus one dog who had appointed himself to a specific duty and was carrying it out with total commitment. Clara moved through the space the way water moves, finding the gaps, filling them, redirecting around the obstacles she could not remove. She did not stop to feel the weight of it. There would be time for that later. For now, the hands had work to do. 3 people with frost-bitten extremities. Eli already being treated. 2 others who had come in with fingers and toes that had gone past discomfort into the dangerous pale. She moved them closest to the hearth without putting them too close, positioning warmed, cloth-wrapped stones against their cores, letting the body's own heat find its way back to the edges on its own time. 2 children under 5, both crying when they arrived and both now asleep against their mothers with the efficiency of very young children who can transition from terror to rest in minutes when the immediate threat is removed. Clara spread the extra quilts across the sleeping shelf where the curved wall radiated its stored warmth, and she put the children there with their mothers and Nora, who had moved without being asked to make room and was sitting cross-legged at the end of the shelf reading her book by firelight with the composure of someone who has decided that being calm is a thing she can offer. The adults sorted themselves with the particular awkwardness of people who are accustomed to disliking each other finding themselves in unavoidable proximity. The 2 brothers who had burned through their wood sat against the right wall and did not speak. The woman with the small children had stopped crying and was watching everything with the wide, still gaze of someone in the aftermath of fright. Della Vane sat beside Eli, one hand on his shoulder. Wade Corbin sat against the wood stack. He had not spoken since he came in. She had cleaned his hands and wrapped them properly, without being asked and without comment, and he had let her do it without speaking. He sat now with his wrapped hands in his lap and his eyes on the chamber floor, and the expression of a man doing some kind of internal accounting that was not going well. Silas sat near the hearth and managed the fire with the economy of long practice, adding wood in the precise amounts needed to maintain the right heat output without burning through the stack faster than necessary. He watched the thread. He watched the fissure. He watched the chamber the way a sailor watches the horizon, continuously, with the peripheral patience of someone who knows that what matters is the trend, not the moment. Clara found the rhythm of it. Check the people. Check the fire. Check the thread. Redistribute warmth where it was needed. Move the wrapped stones to the ones who were still cold. Come back to the hearth. Start again. On the 3rd circuit, she noticed Ezra Marsh. He had come in during the middle rush. Now she saw where he had positioned himself, against the far wall, away from the main group, in the corner near the food pit. Away from the fire, which meant he was one of the colder ones, but not moving toward the warmth. He was looking at the wall. Clara crossed the chamber and stood beside him and looked at what he was looking at. J.M. One Hard Winter. C.S. Still here. Not alone. In the firelight, the carved letters threw small shadows. They were deeper than she had realized when she first found them, cut with the patience and force of someone who had wanted them to outlast their maker by a long time. They had outlasted him by years. They were still here, just as she had written below them, still legible, still speaking. Ezra Marsh raised his hand and placed it flat against the stone, palm against limestone, over his son's name. He did not speak. His face was doing something that faces do when they have held a particular expression for so many years that the change from it is almost physically visible, as if the muscles themselves are relearning a configuration they had forgotten. The certainty was gone. The flatness was gone. What was underneath them was the thing that had always been underneath them, the thing that the certainty and the flatness had been built to cover. Clara went and got a warmed stone from near the hearth, wrapped it in burlap, and brought it back. She set it at his feet without comment. He looked down at it. Then he sat down slowly against the wall, picked up the stone, and held it in both hands. She left him there and went back to work. The storm spoke all night in its various registers. Hours of long sustained pressure against the entrance hide. Hours of a pitch that made conversation difficult. Hours when it seemed to pause, not end, but pause, gather, reconsider, before returning with renewed conviction. Inside the chamber, the temperature held. This was the thing Clara had built for, and the thing she had not quite believed until she was living inside it. The stone's memory was real. All those weeks of fires had worked their heat into the limestone, into the 4-foot walls, into the ceiling, into the floor. The warmth did not come only from the fire burning in the present tense. It came from every fire that had burned before, stored and released in the slow, patient arithmetic of stone. She had treated it right. It was somewhere past the midpoint of the night when Eli Vane spoke. He had been lying against the sleeping shelf with dust pressed against his back for hours. His color had come back around midnight. His feet had gone through the painful stage that indicated circulation returning. The good pain, the necessary pain. And he had not cried, though his jaw had been tight and his hands had gripped the quilt in fists. After the pain came the exhaustion, and she had thought he was asleep. He was not asleep. Dust had shifted during the night, moving so that more of his weight was against Eli's back, his chin resting on the boy's shoulder. Eli's hand had found the dog's flank somewhere in the dark and was resting there, fingers loosely curled in the rough, brindle coat. "Good dog," Eli said, very quietly. "You're a good dog." The chamber was not silent. There was the fire, the storm outside, the breathing of 17 people. But something about those 6 words landed in a gap between all of it. Several people heard them. Della Vane, sitting close, closed her eyes. Silas, near the hearth, turned his face toward the wall and did not turn back for a moment. Even one of the brothers who had not spoken all night looked up. Nora, on the sleeping shelf, had stopped reading. She was watching Eli's face. Then she looked at her mother across the chamber, and the look contained something that would have been impossible to translate into words, but that Clara understood completely. The particular comprehension of a child who has witnessed something true and knows it. Clara nodded once. Nora looked back at Eli. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested in Dust's fur. Nobody spoke about it. It was not the kind of moment that benefits from speech. Callum Hayes had come in the second wave, behind the family with a cracked chimney and ahead of the brothers. He had arrived in better condition than most and spent the first hour making himself useful in the efficient, unassuming way that revealed a man accustomed to assessing a situation and filling the gap that needed filling without waiting to be directed. He asked before doing anything, every time, without exception. A question, a nod, and then the work. Clara noticed it, the way you notice something that is conspicuous by its rarity. When the second wave of arrivals had stabilized and the chamber had reached its equilibrium, Clara sat down on the stone bench near the hearth for the first time in hours. She had not eaten since morning. Callum appeared beside her with a cup of warm water and a piece of cornbread from the bottom of the food pit that she had completely forgotten was there. She looked at the cup, then at him. "You need to eat something," he said, not unkindly, simply as a fact. She took the cup. She ate the cornbread. He sat down on the opposite end of the bench, and they stayed like that in the kind of quiet that is not awkward but restful. The quiet of two people who are each comfortable enough with their own thoughts not to need to fill the air between them. Everyone else was asleep or close to it. Even the storm had shifted into something lower and more sustained, less violent, the way a fire shifts when the initial fuel is spent, and it has settled into what it actually is. "My wife used to say," Callum said, quietly enough not to carry, "that the best thing you can build is something that keeps the people you love warm." Clara looked at the fire. She sounds like she was wise. She was practical, which in my experience is usually the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. She would have come up this hollow the first week and asked how she could help. She sounds like she was better at asking than most. Better than me. I waited too long. He said it simply, without self-pity, as a fact about himself that he had made peace with. "I saw what you were building, and I thought it was interesting, and then I thought it was impressive, and then I realized I was finding reasons to come back and look at it that had nothing to do with the stonework." Clara turned her cup in her hands. "Nora figured that out before I did," she said. "Children usually do." The fire shifted. A piece of oak broke apart in the coals and resettled, sending a brief, upward flutter of light that played across the chamber walls and the sleeping faces and the carved letters near the entrance. His hand was resting on the bench between them. She looked at it, the particular look that is not quite a decision, but is the moment before one. Then she placed her hand over his. Neither of them spoke. From behind the blanket divider, from the direction of the sleeping shelf, there was a small sound that might have been a child pretending to be more asleep than she was. Clara chose not to investigate. They sat like that while the storm spoke its long, slow, diminishing argument against the stone, and the stone said nothing in return, and the fire breathed, and the people inside the rock kept living. The baby was not expected. Of the 17 people in the chamber, one was a woman named Greta, a quiet woman who had arrived in the middle wave with her husband and had positioned herself near the back of the chamber without asking for anything. She had seemed simply cold and frightened, like the others. It was Nora who noticed first. Nora had woken in the deep middle of the night and was lying quietly watching the chamber, and she came to Clara's elbow and tugged it and said in the smallest voice, "Something is happening with the woman in the corner." Something was. What happened next involved Della Vane, who turned out to know considerably more about such matters than her composure would have suggested, and Clara, who knew enough from her mother's careful instruction to be useful, and Silas, who was asked to face the wall and did so without comment and without moving from that position for a considerable time. It was not easy. Nothing about it was easy. The circumstances were wrong. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong everything except for the warmth and the fire and the 17 people holding their collective breath in a limestone chamber while the storm raged pointlessly outside against walls that were not going to move. But the baby arrived. She was small and loud and indignant about her situation in the way that new arrivals often are. And when she cried, the sound of it hit the stone ceiling and the stone walls and came back from all directions at once. And it was a different kind of sound from all the sounds the chamber had held that night. A sound that was not about surviving. A sound that was simply, unambiguously, new. Greta's husband, a man named Harmon, who had not said 10 words all night, was given his daughter to hold. He was a large man with hands that looked built for labor, and the baby was very small, and he held her with the careful immobility of someone terrified of dropping the most important thing he had ever been handed. "What's her name?" Nora asked, from behind Della's elbow where she had positioned herself at some point and remained throughout. Harmon looked at his wife. Greta was exhausted in the way of someone who has just done the hardest work available to a human body, and she was smiling the smile that belongs exclusively to that particular exhaustion. She said one word: hope. Harmon looked at his daughter. "Hope," he said, testing it, confirming it. Then he looked up, around the chamber, at the stone walls, and the fire, and the sleeping people, and the dog, and the child, and the old man, and the widow who had built all of this. And his face did the thing faces do when they understand something they did not understand before. Ezra Marsh had woken at some point during this. He was sitting upright against the wall with his eyes open, watching. When Harmon looked around the chamber, his eyes stopped on the old farmer in the corner. Harmon crossed the chamber and stood in front of him. Ezra Marsh looked at the baby. Harmon held her out, not forcing, offering. The question that did not need to be spoken. Ezra Marsh looked at the baby for a long moment. Then he raised his arms and received her, slowly and carefully, and she settled against his chest the way babies settle when they find something warm, and he sat with her and looked at her face, and did not move for a very long time. Nobody watched him too directly. There are things people need to do without being observed, and this was one of them. Nora's fever broke just before the light changed. Clara had known the fever was coming since the middle of the night. She had felt the heat in her daughter's forehead with the precision that mothers develop for this particular temperature. She had kept Nora hydrated, kept her warm but not too warm, monitored the breathing. She had sat beside the sleeping shelf for the last 2 hours of the night, doing the thing that mothers do when there is nothing left to do but be present. The vigil that is itself a form of labor. When Nora's forehead went from hot to warm, it happened quietly, between one breath and the next. The flushed color in her cheeks softened. Her breathing deepened and slowed into the pattern of true rest. She opened her eyes. The fire had burned down to deep coals that threw a red-orange light across everything, softer than flame, the light of sustained heat rather than new burning. Outside, the sound of the storm had shifted into something that was still large, but no longer violent. Nora looked at her mother's face. "Mama," she said, "are we still here?" Clara put her hand on her daughter's cheek. Warm. The right kind of warm. "Yes, baby," she said, "we're still here." Nora looked around the chamber, at all the sleeping people, at dust, at the fire, at the thread above the entrance still pulling its gentle and steady pull toward the fissure. "The stone held," she said. "Yes." "You knew it would." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the night she had sat in the snow with 3 matches and a failed fire, thinking about going back. She thought about the morning she had stood alone after Silas left and done the arithmetic that did not add up. She thought about every night she had lain awake listening to the thread and the fissure and the breathing of a child she was trying to protect against a world that had decided to be difficult about it. "No," she said honestly. "I hoped it would. There's a difference." Nora considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "What's the difference?" "Knowing means you can't fail. Hoping means you might. And you do it anyway." Clara smoothed the quilt over her daughter's shoulder. "Go back to sleep. The storm's almost done." Nora put her hand out, and dust came to her, and she settled with him at her side, and in a few minutes she was asleep again, with her hand in his fur and the right temperature in her cheeks, and 17 people breathing around her in the warm dark of a room made of stone and patience, and the knowledge that someone had taken the time to learn what the rock was trying to say. Clara sat beside her for a long time. Then she got up, checked the thread, added a piece of oak to the coals, and let the chamber keep doing what she had built it to do. Outside, the storm was ending. The morning came the way mornings come, after hard things, not triumphantly, not with drama, but simply and completely, the light arriving as it always had, indifferent to what the night had cost. Clara was already awake when the darkness began to thin. She had not slept. She had sat by the dying coals through the last hours of the storm and thought about many things, and had not resolved most of them, and that was all right. Some things did not resolve. They simply became part of the ground you stood on going forward. She pulled the entrance height aside and stepped out into the hollow. The world had been remade. Snow had filled every hollow and covered every edge and softened every hard thing, until the valley below looked like something from a different story. Not the small, knowing, judgment-heavy place she had come to understand over these weeks, but something open and clean and without memory. The cedars on the bluff were bent double under the weight of it. The sky above was the pale particular blue that follows serious weather, the color of something that has spent itself completely and rests now in the aftermath. She was still standing there when Silas came to stand beside her. He looked at the valley for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at the bluff above the entrance, at the fissure that had drawn clean all night, at the entrance stones that had held everything out that needed holding out. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. That was enough. They came out one by one as the morning settled. The family with the small children first, the children astonished by the snow. Harmon carried Hope against his chest, wrapped in the cleanest cloth Greta could manage, and Greta walked beside him with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body has recently done extraordinary things. Delavane came out with Eli beside her. The boy walked on his own feet, which was the right outcome for the kind of frostbite he had come in with. He would be more careful about his boots for the rest of his life, which was a lesson worth the cost of learning. He met Clara's eyes when he came through the entrance, and what was in that look was not what usually passed between 12-year-old boys and adult women, and she understood it for what it was. One person had not survived the storm, The old man who lived alone at the edge of the valley and had refused every warning found the morning after still in his chair. Clara stood in front of his house for a moment before walking back up the hollow. She did not feel what triumph felt like. She felt the weight of what unnecessary cost looks like, and it was heavy in a different way than the other weights she had been carrying. Ezra Marsh came to find Clara alone in the chamber on the afternoon after the storm, when the others had gone, and the hollow had settled back into the particular quiet of a place that has survived something large. He stood at the entrance and looked at the chamber he had just come out of, at the entrance stones, at the double hanging of the hide, at the drainage channel that had carried the storm's runoff cleanly away from the opening all night. He looked at Clara. "My boy died in this rock," he said. His voice was different from any register she had heard from him before. Not the declarative certainty of a man delivering judgment, not the grief-covered authority of a man who has built a wall around his loss and is defending it. Just a voice. An old man's voice saying a thing that was true. He died because nobody taught him to read it. Clara looked at him. "You learned to read it," he said. "You learned what he didn't know. And you kept 17 people alive in the place that killed him." He was quiet for a moment. "That matters. I don't know what else to say about it, but it matters." He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not offer apology in the formal sense. He simply stated what was true and let it stand, which was in its way more honest than a performance of remorse would have been. "I know what you lost," Clara said. "I'm sorry you lost it." He nodded once. Then he walked down the hollow through the snow, moving carefully but steadily, not looking back. Clara watched him go. She thought about the letters carved in the stone. J.M. One hard winter. She thought about a young man who had found the right place and not known how to use it. She thought about what it would mean to her if it had been Nora. If Nora had come to this hollow years from now and not known what she needed to know, and the stone had not been able to save her because the knowledge had not been passed down. That thought sat with her for a moment, cold and clarifying. Then she turned back to the entrance, because there was still work to do. Wade Corbin had not moved from against the wood stack when the others began to leave. He was still there when Clara came back inside. He looked worse in the morning light than he had in the firelight. His face had the quality of a man who has spent several hours doing arithmetic he did not enjoy. He was a man who had organized his understanding of himself around a certain version of events. A version in which Clara Sutton was a foolish woman making a foolish choice, in which the stone hollow was a joke and the cold would prove it, in which his own judgment was the fixed point around which everything else was supposed to orbit. That version had not survived the night. He reached into his coat with his wrapped hands, slowly, carefully, managing the pain, and took out a folded paper. He set it on the flat stone that served as their table. Clara looked at it without touching it. "The filing," he said. "I'm withdrawing it." She looked at him. "You said once that the land was worthless." Her voice was even. "You said it in front of everyone who would listen. You said my daughter deserved better than an animal mother in an animal hole." Wade looked at the floor. "I did say that. Did you mean it?" A long pause. The kind that means the person is deciding whether to say the true thing or the manageable thing. "I meant to keep the land," he said finally. "The rest was the means to that." He looked at his wrapped hands. Nora's not what this was about. I know what it was about. Clara picked up the paper. She looked at it. The formal language, the filed complaint, the machinery of county process that he had set in motion against her. She folded it again along its original lines. Nora was never what it was about. She was leverage. She set the paper down. That's the part that's harder to forgive than the rest of it. Wade had no answer for that. There was no good answer for it. "This doesn't change anything," he said finally. And there was something almost reflexive about it. A man reaching for the armor of his own certainty and finding it had been left out in the storm. "The land is still. Go home, Wade." Clara's voice was not harsh. It was simply finished. "You have burns that need looking after. Go home." He stood up slowly. He walked to the entrance and stopped there, looking out at the snow-covered hollow. He did not say anything else. He walked out into the snow and down the hollow, and she watched him go. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel relief, exactly. She felt the feeling of a door closing on a room she had not wanted to be in, and the ordinary light of the hallway afterward. She picked up the withdrawal paper and put it in the tin box where she kept the important documents. Then she went to check on Nora. The weeks that followed had a different quality from any that had come before. Not easy. Nothing about the hollow was ever easy, but settled. The wood stack needed filling. The orchard needed planting on the south-facing slope where the sun reached longest. The drainage channel needed extending before the spring melt arrived. There was always work, and the work had always been the answer. And Clara understood now that this was not a burden, but a gift. The kind of life that kept you moving left very little room for the fear that comes with standing still. Silas worked alongside her through those weeks, slower than before. She noticed it and did not mention it, and he noticed that she noticed and did not mention that either. Some things are better understood in silence between people who have spent a winter learning to read what the air is telling them. The community came to her with questions. She answered them all. She held nothing back. The methods she had learned from her father and developed with Silas spread through the valley the way useful knowledge spreads when it is freely given, quietly, without ceremony, through the hands of people teaching other people. Della Vane did not say she had been wrong. She did the Della thing, which was to arrive one afternoon with a canvas sack containing onion sets and a length of burlap, set them inside the entrance without comment, and begin asking detailed questions about the food pit. This was as close to an apology as Della Vane had in her, and Clara received it as the full thing it was. Silas died on a morning in early spring, when the snow was still on the ridge, but the hollow had begun to show the first cautious green of things, deciding to try again. Clara found him sitting against the wood stack, hands folded in his lap, eyes closed, face carrying the peace of someone whose long internal argument has finally arrived at settlement. The fire he had built before dawn was still burning, which meant he had been there since before the light, tending the thing he had always tended. She sat with him for an hour before she told anyone. She held his hand, which was still warm from the fire he had built. She looked at the chamber they had made together, the double hanging at the entrance, the stone bench, the sorted wood, the ceiling thread, the fissure that had pulled clean all winter. She tried to find the words for what she was feeling and did not find them, which she thought he would have considered appropriate. He had always preferred work to language. The things they had built together were more eloquent than anything she could have said. She buried him on the slope above the hollow, where he could see the bluff and the entrance and the valley below. She chose the stones herself, flat limestone, dense and well-fitted, the kind he had taught her to choose. She fitted them together without mortar, the way he had shown her, each stone chosen for the particular gap it needed to fill, the whole structure held by nothing but weight and precision. She carved the marker herself, with the carpenter's nail she had been carrying since before any of this began. He taught the stone to speak. She learned to listen. She stepped back and looked at it for a long time. Then she went back down the hollow and built up the fire and made something for Nora to eat, because the work did not stop when the grief arrived, which was something Silas himself had demonstrated every day of his life. The proposal happened on an afternoon in late spring, when the orchard on the south-facing slope was showing its first tentative leaves, and the hollow had finally thawed down to the bedrock, and the world had the particular quality of a place that has survived something and is surprised to find itself continuing. Callum Hayes had been coming up the hollow 3 or 4 times a week for the past month. He came with materials when there were materials to bring, and with nothing in particular when there was nothing to bring, which was more often. He had built a proper step at the entrance from good flat limestone. He had helped extend the drainage channel. He had repaired the sled runners for hauling wood in a way that would outlast both of them. He was on the roof of the small outbuilding they had been adding to the side of the bluff when he stopped working and sat on the edge of the roof and looked down at Clara, where she was mortaring the last course of the workshop wall. "Clara," he said. She did not look up from the wall. "The mortar needs to be worked before it sets." "I know. This will take a minute." She looked up. He was sitting on the roof edge with his hat in his hands, and he had the expression of a man who has organized exactly what he wanted to say and is now confronting the difference between the organized version and the actual saying of it. "I'm not good at this kind of thing," he said. "I'm better with stone than with this kind of thing." "You're good with stone," she agreed. "I'd like to keep coming up here, not just for the building." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'd like to come up here because this is where you are, you and Nora. I'm asking if you'd consider it. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm asking." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then from somewhere behind her, from the direction of the chamber entrance, where a certain 8-year-old girl had been suspiciously quiet for the past several minutes, came a voice. "Say yes, Mama." A pause. "Dust likes him." Clara turned. Nora was sitting in the entrance with her book closed in her lap and the expression of someone who has been there for a while and has no intention of pretending otherwise. Dust sat beside her with the same expression, if a dog can be said to have expressions, which Clara had long since stopped questioning. Clara looked at her daughter, at the dog, at the man sitting on the roof with his hat in his hands, having just been unwittingly endorsed by a child and a brindle dog simultaneously, which was possibly the most thorough endorsement available in the circumstances. She laughed. Not a smile, not the careful, guarded expression she had been wearing for months to keep hope at arm's length. A real laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that comes when something is genuinely funnier and more perfect than you were prepared for. "Yes," she said, and then she went back to the mortar before it set, because the work did not stop, and Callum Hayes climbed down from the roof and came to work beside her, And Nora opened her book again with the satisfied air of someone who had played a small and decisive role in the proper outcome of things. The years moved the way years do when the hardest work is behind you, not slowly or quickly, but in layers, each one settling over the one before, the way stone layers settle over stone. Nora grew into someone Clara recognized and was also always surprised by. A young woman with her grandfather's hands and her mother's habit of going very still when she was thinking hard, and a mind that moved between practical and philosophical with the ease of someone who had grown up understanding that these were not different things. She became a teacher because teaching was what she knew how to do. She had been taught by her mother and by Silas and by the stone walls of the hollow, and she believed in the particular, unshakable way of people who have learned something through experience rather than instruction, that knowing how to read what the world was telling you was the most valuable thing one person could give another. She taught them something else too, that knowledge only helps when it is given away. Her father had taught her, which his father had taught him, which some unnamed person before that had figured out through trial and error in a cold place with too little time. That knowledge had saved her life and 17 others, not because she had hoarded it as proof of her worth, but because she had used it and then handed it to anyone who came and asked. Knowledge kept in a closed fist helps only the hand that holds it. Knowledge opened feeds the whole valley through the winter. Nora's son, Clara's grandson, grew up in the hollow and left to study how stone and air and water work together, and he wrote about it. In what he wrote, he cited a woman who had learned to read what the rock was telling her and then taught everyone else to listen. He used her name. He wanted it remembered. The community that had once stood on church steps and called her a cave woman came to Clara with questions. She answered them all. She held nothing back. The methods she had learned from her father and developed with Silas spread through the valley the way useful knowledge spreads when it is freely given, quietly, without ceremony, through the hands of people teaching other people, each generation passing to the next what it would need. The community that had once stood on church steps and called her a cave woman came to Clara with questions. She answered them all. She held nothing back. Callum built a proper workshop, then a second outbuilding, then a path down the slope with flat limestone steps, each one fitted without mortar, each one chosen for its specific place. He asked before doing anything. He always asked. Clara had come to understand that this was simply how he was built. A man who believed that asking was not weakness, but the correct way of moving through a world that belonged to other people as much as it belonged to him. They were married in the chamber, because that was where it had all happened, and because nowhere else felt right. Della came. Ezra Marsh stood at the back and did not speak, but did not leave, which was his version of blessing. Harmon and Greta brought Hope, who was by then old enough to walk and young enough to insist on being carried simultaneously, depending on her assessment of the situation. Hope wore a white dress and spent most of the ceremony investigating dust with the focused intensity of someone conducting important research. Dust died on a morning in autumn, several years after the winter that had made him famous in the way that animals become famous. Not by doing extraordinary things, but by doing the ordinary thing of being exactly what was needed at exactly the moment it was needed. He had slowed over the past year in the way that dogs slow, not dramatically, not with complaint, but simply with a gradual reduction in the urgency of his movements, as though he had come to an understanding with the world that it was not going anywhere, and neither was he. He still met Clara at the entrance each morning. He still pressed against Nora's side when she sat reading. He still watched the hollow with his one good eye and his one cloudy one, both of them still doing the work they had always done. He died beside Nora on an autumn morning with his head in her lap and the last of the season's warmth on the stone outside and the hollow quiet around them. She did not know when exactly it happened. One moment he was breathing, and the next the particular quality of his stillness was different, and she sat with him a long time before she went inside to tell her mother. They buried him on the slope above the hollow, beside Silas, where both of them could see the entrance in the valley below and whatever else there was to see from that ridge. The stone Clara chose for his marker was limestone, flat and dense, and fitted precisely without mortar. He found the door when all she could see was rock. She pressed her hand against the stone for a moment after she finished carving it. Then she stood up and looked at the two graves side by side. The old man who had taught her to read the stone, and the dog who had found the crack that started everything. And she thought about how much of what she had built rested on those two facts. An old man's patience, a dog's instinct, a crack in a rock face, and a woman who was willing to follow a dog to see where he was trying to go. She went back down the hollow. The orchard was showing its colors. The workshop was full of work in progress. The path down the slope had settled into the hillside so completely that it looked like it had always been there, which was the best thing you could say about a path. Many years later, a child sat beside an old woman at the entrance to a chamber in a limestone bluff and asked the question that children ask when they are old enough to understand that the adults around them have histories that predate them. "Great-grandma," she said, "were you scared?" The woman beside her had hands that had the look of hands that had done a great deal of work over a long time. Not damaged hands, but hands with a kind of density and confidence that comes from decades of knowing what they were for. She was looking at the valley below, which had changed in some ways, and not in others, the way valleys do. "Every single day," she said. "Every single day, my darling." The child considered this. "Then how did you keep going?" The old woman placed her palm flat against the limestone of the entrance, the stone that had been there longer than anyone could measure, that had held its warmth through winter after winter, that had remembered everything it needed to remember. "I listened to what the stone was telling me," she said, "and I refused to stop listening." The child looked at the entrance, at the carved letters visible just inside, layers of them now, added by hands over the years, names and small marks left by people who had passed through and wanted to leave something of themselves behind. At the very bottom of all of them, barely visible but still legible to someone who knew to look, the first two lines, J.M., one hard winter. C.S., still here, not alone. "Will you teach me?" the child asked. The old woman looked at her granddaughter, at the dark eyes that were Nora's eyes, and the stillness that was a quality the family had always carried, and the particular quality of the attention she brought to things, which was a quality Clara recognized because she had spent a lifetime trying to cultivate it in herself. "Yes," she said, "everything your great-grandfather once taught me, everything the stone taught me, everything the old man who knew the caves taught me before he died." She took her hand from the wall. All of it. I will teach you all of it. The child leaned against her and looked at the valley, and the old woman put her arm around her, and they sat like that, while the light changed over the hollow and the long shadow of the bluff moved across the snow-covered slope to where two graves faced the valley, patient and permanent, in the way of stone. The thread above the entrance moved in its slow and steady pull. The fisher breathed. The rock held its warmth. The stone never lies. And neither did she.